Okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and everybody just kind of mute yourselves unless you want to jump in with a question. And otherwise, Deb, take it away.
All right. So thank you all for having me tonight. I'm really excited. This is a newer presentation for me, but this is also one thing that I got to be honest is very topical for me. We've been having multiple conversations at work about this. So it's something that is really on the forefront. And to be honest, it's been something I've been doing my entire career. And it's nice because I get to take a look at something that I just kind of took for granted for a while. So we're going to talk about database deployment methods. So, for those of you who don't know me, I've been working as a DBA for over 20 years, um, pretty much on the development side of things, from working with developers on what tables to create, how to create them, to everything to getting out the door to troubleshooting once it's in production. I've mainly worked with SQL Server. I've done a couple other database systems, just enough to do some damage. I'm mostly transactional as well, but again, enough of the marts and warehouses so I could do some damage if need be. I'm a board member of the New England SQL Server User Group, and that is the local user group here in the greater Boston area. We're actually, I think, one of the oldest user groups around, or we've been around for a while. I'm also a member of the Azure Data Community Advisory Council. So it's kind of an advisory board to kind of make sure that user groups like yourselves have access to things that you need and kind of helping create a community that got lost after pass. We're not pass, but we're more, here to help. I was named one of the Redgate 100, one to watch recently, and I was awarded the MVP for the data platform a couple years ago. So I'm still feeling like I need to live up to that title. So hopefully, but for me, it really means I love to have these conversations and share what I've learned and my experiences with all of you. So this is actually the really important stuff to know about me. I'm the alto section leader in my choir. I try to go to bluegrass jams regularly. I've been learning guitar and I have a mandolin I'm neglecting. I'm kind of a musical theater geek. And when I'm not doing any of that stuff, Andy and I like doing geeky things with our dogs, like, posing him in front of computers and, making have appearances and keynotes at things like Summit and such. Um, but this is, like I said, this is really the important things to know about me. So with that, let's move on to to why we're really here tonight. And that's to talk about database deployment methods. And it's funny, I want to kind of stop and think about why should we talk about it? Why should we have more conversations about this? Because, you know, we all start off this way. We have our database, we have our change, magic happens, and then the change gets added to wherever it needs to go, whether it's a different environment, whether it goes to production, installer, whatever it is. But it's that magic that happens. We don't talk about it. We talk about the tooling for it, but we don't talk about what we're actually doing with those tools. So, one thing to kind of set a standard here, this is not just DevOps. I don't call this a DevOps session. I think at one point when I first was trying to say I should do this, I want to say explicitly, this isn't a DevOps session. It feeds into DevOps, but it's not just DevOps. Partly because we all have code to deploy. There's changes being made somewhere and it's got to go somewhere else. We all have to do that, regardless of what we're doing. And this is our daily workflow. How do we get something out? I've got code I'm working on. I need to go at it next week. How am I doing it? That affects how I do my job and what I'm putting together every day. There's a new term floating around, data ops. It's kind of like DevOps, but except for it's really focused on database. I'm really not one for some of these terms because I don't care what you call it or what it fits into. If you're agile, if you're waterfall, if you're agile pretending to be waterfall, waterfall pretending to be agile, it doesn't matter what methodology you do you place in your software lifecycle development. You have database changes. This matters because everything that you do that you're setting out for the deploys are going to be based off of how are you deploying your scripts. So Couple related terms and things to think about. Source of truth. Some of these I originally put together. I'm like, I must be making this up. Source of truth is some weird term that I'm coming up with in my own head to describe it. And I think I picked it up from somewhere, although I can't figure out where. Otherwise, I'd give you that attribute. But essentially, the idea is we need something to say, this is what my database looks like. Um, but the thing is, there could be multiple sources of truth. Maybe you have a different version of this database, the November version versus the December. Your November source of truth should be different than your December source of truth. But at any point, you should be able to go somewhere and say, yes, this is what my database is supposed to look like. It's not just for troubleshooting. Hey, do they have the latest release? It's partly, but it's also something that you can use as you're testing along the way. Hey, if I deploy this code, will it look like my source of truth at the end? So I think it's really important that you have a solid, and I'm using the word artifact, but whatever it is, something that you can rely on to say, this is what my database is supposed to look at. Some people may use DAC packs. I kind of use what you check into source control, how you label things, how you branch things. There are lots of different things, but you need to determine what that is. The next is kind of the idea of a database as code. And this is really one of those concepts that for me was the hardest to grasp. And when it made sense, everything kind of clicked. Because a database is kind of in a weird state if you think about it. We think of our database sitting on our SQL server. It's actively being used, it's actively being changed, it's monitored. It's not something like an executable. Something changes, you can just swap out the code. It doesn't work that way. You've got to deal with the data, protecting the data, and every change you make kind of rolls forward. And the way you have to handle it and treat it and work with it is very different than, let's say, an application, whether it's an executable, whether it's a web page that's getting deployed somewhere. However, all of that stuff works, we have to handle the database differently. But when it comes to thinking about how we release everything, we really do need to think of database as code. This is why it gets into source control. We're not checking our backup into source control, hopefully, but we're doing treating the way that we treat the objects and creating the scripts for those that we would check into source control. So it really is, especially if we're going to think about how we migrate things and how we release changes, really this idea of database as code is really integral to thinking about how we approach those sort of things. I mean, again, we still have to acknowledge that there are differences in how what a database is versus an application, but in terms of how we handle deployments, database as code is really an important concept to grasp. And like I said, once it started making sense for me, a lot of other things started falling in place. So, requirements. I'm a big fan of requirements. I'm not a fan of tools being the solution. I'm a fan of what are we trying to do here and making sure we figure out what solution fits that best. So we're going to do some demos talking about this stuff. And these are the requirements that I kind of use as my way of saying, this is how we're going to do a deployment. Some of these are my personal things, and I always make sure that this is what they are, regardless of where I'm working. Just because for me, it gives me a sense of it's kind of testing that source of truth. How do I know that my database is good? Do I know my code is good? So the first one, I want to be able to create a new database or upgrade an existing one. I think when we talk about deployments, it's a pretty reasonable requirement. Whenever we're done, a newly created database and an upgraded database should be the same, right? There are going to be caveats. Let's say you're deprecating a feature. We're not releasing a store procedure to a new database anymore because, well, it's not going to be run. We don't need to add it. Or we're deprecating a table. We're not ready to lose the data, but we kind of create like a deprecated or delete me schema, and then we move the table there. We know there's going to be reasons why things are off, but whatever strategy you implement is going to make it clear why that's the case. But in the end, that core set of objects, they should match one for one. You want everything to be the same because, again, I want to know whether I create a brand new database or an existing database, by the end, I have the schema that should be out in both places. It doesn't matter how I do it. And this fun one is deployments must be rerunnable. I'm trying to remember what I meant by this asterisk, but I guess the idea is whenever I run something, if I accidentally run a script and I hit execute a second time by accident, I want to know that I'm not creating damage. I want to know that I can run that script safely because everything that should be there is there. And I'm not going to get any errors from that script if I run it again. Or another way of thinking of it is if I've already upgraded my database and I do whatever deployment process I do to upgrade the database, even if it's already upgraded to that version, I know it's going to be fine. There's not going to create any sort of problems. I'm not going to ruin data. I'm not going to accidentally drop a database or a table, hopefully not a database. But you guys get the idea. Whatever it is, it needs to be a repeatable process and in a way that I'm not going to create any sort of problems if it runs a second time immediately afterwards. So, does that make sense? Yes, I see a comment in there. It sounds like I want to be able to pick up where I left off in the upgrade process. Yep, that's it. It makes, for me, it makes life easier. So, but that's exactly it. What I mean by rerunnable. Wherever I am, I want it to do. What about 101 unit testing? We'll get to testing later because, yeah, testing is going to be a part of it. And that's kind of how you get there. And that's things to think about. I'm going to get to some of that stuff later. Yeah, T-SQL-T. Excellent. Deployment scripts should be idempotent? Possibly. We'll get into that. We'll talk about idempotent and what that means. So hang on to that thought. I love these questions because these are all things we're going to discuss. So we are all on the same place. So that's awesome. All right. So let's kind of move on so we can talk about those things. Well, types of deployments. So there are really two main types of deployments that we have available to us. One is a migration-based deployment, and the other is called a state-based deployment. So let's look into that. What are the differences? Start with migration-based. It is a series of scripts executed to deploy database changes. Pure and simple, that's it. Migration is we're scripting out what those changes are. So we have a source database with the 4 stars, 3 hearts, and a moon, and we have our target database, which doesn't have all the objects yet. In a migrations-based script, we would say, okay, I'm creating a script to add a blue star. We're now adding 1 pink heart, and we are adding 1 green moon. And that's it. That's it. I've decided what's going to happen, and that's the script. I'm specifying what those changes are, and these are the only changes that are going to occur because this is what I want to happen. There are a lot of different tools that you can use to accomplish this. Third-party tools, this is not a complete list, and I want to be clear, this is not a complete list. There are others out there. These two are the last two ones that I've used at companies before. So that's why I'm saying liquid-based. Flyway is actually owned by Redgate, but it is open source, but Redgate's kind of, I think it's open source. But Redgate's expanded on it, has a lot of front-end tools that they're working on for it now as well. Again, these are just two examples of them. The way they work is they have tables in your database that say, have I run this script? And it compares. It actually uses a checksum to see if you've made a change to the script as well. And then based on that information, it determines whether it should run the script or whether it should say, hey, you've already run it. So it kind of keeps track of those things for you inside the database. It's a very rudimentary explanation of how they work, but it's one of the ways that they use to keep track of things. You can also do homegrown tools. You can use PowerShell and DBA tools, which I will show you a little bit in a moment. SQL command. So essentially, I can do this creating batch scripts. I have my script. I know what's doing. I can choose PowerShell. I can use SQL command. I can, various tools will have different ways that they do this and how you set them up and how you can do different things to control the version that the scripts are working in. But it's a very easy way that you can create your homegrown scripts to do this. And you can probably build this in, like if you need some other testing, you can use these homegrown tools to create your own scripts and such. And there you go. State-based. So state-based works a little bit differently. It's really about a comparison between the target database and the source database. So you determine, well, it may not be a source database, but whatever your source is, that determines what the differences are, and that will create the SQL that you need for the updates and execute the changes. The most common example that I can think of for this is when you talk about DAC packs. And that's also why I'm not saying source database, because it may not necessarily be a database that you're using as your source. We'll talk more about DAC packs and backpacks, but DAC pack stands for Data Tier Application Package. I don't remember what the B stands for, but it's similar to the DAC pack, except for it actually has data in it as well. So we'll go into this as well later. But that's kind of the biggest example I can think of talking about state-based deployment. So what does that kind of look like? So we have our two examples, our source and our target. Well, instead of me saying, this is what I want to do, like I did for the migration, I'm going to say, run my compare against the source and the target, and then apply the changes. And maybe we have a script that's generated and we run that. Maybe we just say, just run, sit back and let it do its thing. But whatever it is, the tool is what's coming up with the SQL to make the changes and determine what that is. So again, there's some third-party tools for this. For DAC packs, SQL package is it is Microsoft. It is one of their tools that they have that's available for it. And it actually kind of is built into those database projects. So if you do a database project, if you do a deploy and a publish profile, that's state-based deployment. Redgate does have another tool, SQL change automation, that tends to fit in this third-party tool. But you can do this on your own. You have DBA tools. There actually is one published DBA DAC package. I don't know if under the covers, if it calls a SQL package exe, sometimes that tends to happen. But you can also do your create an internal company one. I worked at a company once where that's actually what they did. They had a little application, and inside they said what the schema should look like. And so their deploy was it took that, compared it with what was in the database, and it came up with the changes. I didn't realize that's kind of what it was at the time, but looking back, oh, they created their own state-based migration. So it can be done. It's probably a little more work, and if I were doing that, I would probably stick with, what's already available, but you don't have to if it doesn't work for you. But it's just kind of things to think about. So before I jump into the demos, let me see if there's any other questions so far. Thoughts or requirements of having the ability to roll back a database change. I think it's a great thought, and it's absolutely something that should be a consideration. It's not the forefront of my mind because past companies, I haven't necessarily had to have that as a specific requirement, but it could absolutely be a requirement. It's one of those things, as you're talking about this, it's one of those things you need to think about. And I mentioned this later when we talk about things that you do need to think about when whatever you implement, whether you need to have a rollback strategy. It's absolutely something that you should have a conversation on and figure out what it is. Because again, what if it goes wrong? If you have a small enough database, is it automatically rolling things back? It's also understanding the tools that you're using for deployment. Some of them may have that feature already built in, but also the conversation, okay, what happens if I do get a failure? Do I need to roll back everything, or do I just need for this one feature? How do I handle that? And so it's definitely a requirement as you're setting this up. If you need that, depending on what it is, absolutely have a conversation, figure out what you want to do for rollback. I didn't put in my requirements because I kind of kept it. These are the basic premises that I'm working with. But no, it's definitely something to keep in mind. Anything else? All right. As they come up, keep them in. These are really great conversations and great questions y'all are coming up with. So keep those coming. Um, all right. So as we talk for demos, so what I did is I did create a database, and in my database, I created a, a store procedure that would create a whole bunch of dummy objects for me. I think I may have created 500 tables and 500 store procedures to select from each individual table, just because I wanted to kind of create a large amount of data. So all this stuff is on my GitHub, so you'll be able to access this and play with this stuff later. But I wanted to kind of show you what I have here, nothing up my sleeve. So in my deploy me, I've got two folders that we'll be playing with. One is our migration, and one is our database project, so we can do it state-based. So like I said, I do have stuff here, but we can kind of see, as we go back and forth, we'll kind of jump in here a little bit and move things around possibly. So I'm going to start with migration. Migration is near and dear to my heart because honestly, for most of my career, this is where I've lived. Um, and part of the reason I did this presentation was because I wanted to understand state-based migration a little bit better as well. So it was an excuse for me to kind of explore some of those things and figure out how they work. So I am working in Visual Studio Code right now. Normally I'm in Azure Data Studio, but this notebook is considered a polyglot notebook, and with the latest release, they said you're better off using Visual Studio Code, so that's where we're living right now. Um, so, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to um, create a manual version of this. So what I've done is I've created a PowerShell script. So let's go into my database project, not database project. I'm in the wrong. I'm in the wrong. Where's my Explorer? All right, I'm just going to open the file. Sorry. So I warned you that I'm normally not working in here. So I have a PowerShell script that I've created for a basic migration. So, whoops. So I'm zooming in a little bit. So let's just kind of talk through this. And I really kind of created it a very basic idea. So I'm gonna still not at the top. All right, here we go. So I've located my Git repo and I've just my folder that all my scripts are in. I'm going to use my local 2019 instance, and my database that we're going to use for this is called deploy me migration. So I'm setting my location. So the one thing that I'm doing in my comments here is I'm setting my order of folders to rotate how I'm going through if the folder exists. So I want to create all my schemas. I want to create all my tables. Because I don't want to have to worry about the order that tables get installed in, I'm going to put all my foreign keys in their own folder. So that way I know all my tables are created. I don't have to worry about order of references. My foreign keys will be there. Oops. Functions, views, store procedures, and then data. So that's why I kind of know the order that I want all my different database objects to go in. Just because I feel safe that that's how it's going to work. Confirming that I've got, so one thing I'm also doing is I'm creating a log table to say, where am I in the, what scripts did I run? Not fully like what we have with local base or flyway, but just I want to keep track of things. It's nice to know where I am, what's actually run. So because I know the order that these two need to go in, and I want this script to run regardless of whether it's a new install or an upgrade, I'm specifying that run these two files first. And then I can start looping through my different folders. So I've got my location here, I've got my schemas, so I can go through, make sure everything works, and then I can say insert into my table. So I'm doing it this way, schemas, then I go for tables, foreign keys. Note I'm doing a check to say if it exists, then run things so I don't have any errors. So I've created a little bit of flexibility. There's probably another way I could have written this to make it more efficient, but for right now, this works for what we're trying to do this evening. So again, it's the same pattern, everything else I'm doing. And then but I'm also adding a little thing, writing a note, okay, where am I in the process? So very basic PowerShell script. Maybe one day I'll kind of get back to this and optimize it a little bit more. So going over back to, whoops, I want to go kind of show you what I've got currently in that folder. So my migration folder, right now I just have tables, schemas, and stored procedures. So right now I have really a basic showing of things. And as you can see, I've got 500 tables here, or over 500 tables, plus my log table. And just to kind of show you what this looks like, whoops, it's a very basic, and because I created this from my database, I just had a management studio script everything out, so excuse all the messy stuff. Normally I try to clean up my scripts a little better, but again, for a demo for 500 scripts, this will work for now. Um, but you can see I'm doing a table, but the biggest thing is you'll notice things like if not exists. So I know I can run this script for an upgrade, or I can run it for a new install, and it's going to work. And if I run this script against a database where it already has that table, it'll work. Why? Because I'm checking for existence. I know if it's supposed to be there or not. And if not, it will be there when we're done. So that's kind of what those scripts look like. Again, keeping this very much on the simple side. So let's reset everything. So I'm going to make sure that I've got my SQL Server set up so I can do a couple checks. And what we're going to do is we're going to reset everything. I'm going to make sure that my database is empty. So I'm going to create a connection to my master database just to be sure. And I'm going to drop and create my databases. And let's go over here to Management Studio. Sorry, a couple of extra windows open. And don't need that. And if we look over here, we can see I've got my deployment migration database, and it's empty. So with that, let's go back. And now let's run the PowerShell script to run all the files. So I'm now going to run my PowerShell script, and I'm going to call it from that location. And we can now see, okay, it ran the schema scripts, and we can now see it's running tables, just because I like to know where things are and as part of the process. So it takes a little bit to add a bunch of, 500 tables. Oops. Now we got our stored procs going. And again, 500 stored procs takes a while. I wanted to make sure I had a good number of objects that we can sit there and play with, because we're going to do the same thing once we get over to the state-based migration. So everything ran. So now I'm going to create a connection to that database, and then we can confirm that everything exists. So first thing is I'm running the first 10 tables from systables, and then we're going to look at our migration log. So we can see that we've got, it's random list of tables, so we can see we've got data there. And look, we can see that things ran. So we've got the last couple things that it ran. So it worked as expected. Now I can go back, again, want to make sure that things are rerunnable. I've already done the upgrade. It's already there. Run this again, just to make sure we don't have any errors. Hopefully it won't take as long as it did the first time, because while it's going through all those tables, it doesn't actually have to create anything. So now we've got the stored procedures. And I think I have those as create or alter, so it means it is altering all of those. So that could take a little bit of time. But it's done. So 21 seconds to rerun against a database. It already worked, and I didn't get any errors returned. So far, so good. So now we got to start thinking about what else we're deploying. We're going to do some changes. So the first thing is I'm going to add a data script. So I'm going to take one table, our lookup table, lookup 10, and I'm going to create a data folder in my migration script so we can add it. I already have this set up in my demo files, but first we can see there's nothing in my table. I'm going to copy that over. So I now have that new script, and let's go run our migration. And again, we already know this works because we've already created it. Running our store procs, but we didn't have that directory before, so we should now have a new directory for data. So once it does the store procedures, you can see my PowerShell script already picked it up because I already planned for it to be there, even if it wasn't before. And so now I can run, and oh look, I've got some dummy lookup data. So that's pretty simple. Again, I'm dictating how it works. I throw my script in and it works. Now we have things like schema changes. So how do we want to handle these? You know, I could probably script this out, but I wanted to kind of walk through. So what are we doing? I have a script for demo setup. So one of the scripts that I have checked in is a store procedure that I created to actually create all of our dummy objects. But really, I created it under DBO, and it shouldn't be. Let me reorganize it. Let me move it out of the way. So I'm going to create that new demo setup. So now we're going to go, let's go out of here. So now we're going to go quickly to Windows back to Windows. I've got my demo files. So I've got a couple things. So one, I've got my schema file here. So I can copy that over to migration, schemas, place it here, demo setup schema, and I'm just going to edit it. And so we can take a quick look. And I do have to, and it is written so I can run the script multiple times. So when someone was asking about idempotent scripts, this is what we're talking about. My migration scripts are written so I can run it as many times as possible, and it's not going to fail because I know what I'm expecting. And if it is already there, I don't want it to fail because I haven't created it yet. The reason schemas written this way is because when you do checks for schemas, create schema has to be the first line in a batch, so it doesn't play well with if not exist checks. So this is my workaround for making that work. So that's the first thing. And then the next thing is I need to do my change. So I'm going to go back to my demo files, change schema. So let's check what this one does. Let's edit this in Notepad, pull it over. Here we go. So this is what my script is going to look like. So I have my create or alter, but I know there's a possibility that it's not in that schema yet. So I have to do a check. And if it's a check, then I'm going to move it over. So this is what I'm going to put in for my file. So I'm going to go back to my folder, stored procs, and we have dummy table. So dummy setup, tables, and procs. So if I look at this, well, this doesn't fully look like what I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and take this full script and do it, check this in here. One other thing that I had already done, which I forgot to reset, which is rename. So my demo setup, I like having scripts named a certain way. This was just originally DBO setup. This is one of those things that we need to think about how we deal with repositories, because I've got what we have here is set up in a repo. So if I wanted to change this, it's making sure that I'm going to Git and doing the rename through here, so that gets the change of a name gets through source control. Um, it's one of those weird things that you have to think about, but it's one of those details in however we're choosing to do this, and especially if you naming convention matters in terms of things like how a file is picked up, or how things like Liquibase and Flyway both really care about what you name your files, because it needs to know what file it's looking at. So if you change a name, it actually does matter, but it also means that you got to make sure it goes right into source control. So when it's time to deploy, source control is pulling back the right name as well. So this one I've already renamed, so it's already matching, because for my purposes, I actually do like seeing that the schema attached with the object, especially when we're not dealing with DBO. It helps me find where things are. I'm a very big believer. I want to look at a script and I want to know exactly what my object should look like. So I've made those changes. Let's see, what else do I need to do? I talked about Git control. So now we're at the point where I can run this script. So I can go back, run the schema. And while we do that, I'm going to go over here, see if there are any questions. All right, no questions yet. But we now have our schemas and our data. So now I can look at my sysprocs, and we can now see that the schema for my stored proc is now demo set up. Any questions about that? I mean, this is a pretty basic example of what it means for migrations and what a migration may look like. All right. So now let's get into the little more complicated side of things. Let's look at migration. Let's look at state-based deployment. And this is, like I said, this was new for me, so it's really interesting to think about how that worked. And for this, I took the same database and I created a database project, and I'm going to use Visual Studio to deal with this. You can do database projects in VS Code and Azure Data Studio. Some of the functionality that we'll be doing, I find, is more complete in Visual Studio, which is why I'm choosing to do that here. It just makes a little more sense to me. So what we're talking about is, this is what our database projects look like. We can do things like have different properties that we set up for the project. Let's take a look at some of our properties. And it's, for some reason, Visual Studio doesn't always refresh the way I want it to. Here we go. So now we can look at different project settings. Certain things that we care about are builds. And this is where we talk about database as code and really thinking about what it means to have a solution using through like Visual Studio and creating a build. For me, that's always been in the application world, partly because I've always dealt with migration scripts. But seeing how it's built in here, database as code really starts making sense, because this is exactly how we're treating it. So we have the concept of a build output. We can do things like debug. We can command variables. So this way, if you do things like reference, let's say, another database, you have cross database references, you can set up variables. So that way you don't have to hard code database names in here. You can create a variable for that database, and when you run it, it's going to be replaced. But also notice something else. It's not just any variable. It's a SQL command variable. So we don't use it often, or maybe I don't use it often, but when you create the scripts through using database projects, the script that's generated needs to be run in SQL command mode. Again, it's not one that I feel is used often, nor day to day, but when you talk about this, it does, and it means that you've got a greater variety of variables that are available to you. So that's actually really one thing to keep in mind about how this works. So I just kind of wanted to poke through some of the things that we have, some of the options available here. The other thing I wanted to point out is the idea of references. So this, again, we start talking about things of code. So notice some of the things we can do. We can add a reference. The big ones that I will put out here are adding a database reference. So what does that mean? let's say I'm using something like, if I have cross database references, what the build will do is it'll go and make sure the object exists in that database, or whether it's a database, whether it's a DAC pack, um, whether it's another project in whatever solution you're doing. So wherever you're pointing, it's going to make sure that whatever you're referencing actually is there. So it's a way of a check that you don't normally have with your migration scripts. I don't know if a cross database reference is what I'm expecting it to be until I actually run my migration script. This will do that check for me, which is kind of a cool thing. But you can also do things like add a master database as a reference. This is great if you do things like have dynamic SQL and you need to use SP execute SQL. Because if you do a build and you don't have your system database, your master database there, it will actually give you a warning saying, hey, this thing doesn't exist. I don't know if it's right or not. So let's just add that. So otherwise, when you create the project, you have an option on how you want to sort your code and display your code. Right now, chose by schema, and then you've got things like data, store procedure, and tables. See, so let's remove this one for now, and we'll come back to what this looks like. But again, you can move things and change things there, and then when you're done, you can have everything set. You can right-click and you choose Build Your Solution. So what it's doing right now is it's going through those checks. What tables are there? What the objects look like? Are all my references there? And it takes just a moment because, Visual Studio takes a second to do. That or my machine is just being very slow because it knows I'm doing a demo. There it goes. It's a little worried there. And we can see that it succeeded. But here's the thing to kind of take note of. When it does a build, what is it building? And if you look, you'll see right here, it creates that DAC pack. So our data application tier package. So let's take a look at that actually and really see what that is, because I find that really fascinating. So let's go back to here. Let's go to our database project. And here we can go bin, debug, and this is the package that was just created. Now, all a DAC pack is, it's a zip file with a bunch of XML files in between. And I believe that if we go back to our demo files, I've already done a creation of that. Actually, I did that with the backpack, which is the DAC, which has data in it, is a really way to say that. One of the ways you can create that is you can create that from your database. And these are actually used if you wanted to migrate your database on-prem to a Azure SQL database. With 2022, you've got managed instances, so you can now actually start linking things and probably do things that way. But for a long time, the way you migrated your on-prem database to Azure, you used a backpack. I've already taken my backpack, I've made it a zip file so I can open it up and kind of see the contents. And what you see here, these 4 XML files, you will see in just the regular DAC pack with a D. And we can look at this if I hit open, see if it opens. Let's do, where's Notepad++? Let's just do WordPad for now. Yeah, sorry, my machine seems to be running a little slow this evening. Actually, I have it here, so let's do it this way. But we can see we have the XML of what we're doing, and it has all the information about what we've built. But then we can go through and start seeing things like, hey, I've got my store proc. We see all the code for my store procedure. And then we can kind of start going down to things like let's look for lookup 10. this table that we're doing. And now we can see we have an element where it's creating the table, and we can see information on it. And then we can start seeing all the columns. Notice one thing that you don't see here is you don't see the column order, because that's actually not stored in your in the XML anywhere. It's a little weird, but it's not stored here. Foreign keys and indexes actually get stored elsewhere as well. We have start seeing constraints. Well, we do see some constraints here, but let's see if we have a PK somewhere. Primary key constraints, yeah, those are kept as separate elements too. So it's really interesting the way things are set up in the DAC pack, but it's done so it can figure out quickly how to create those statements and what it's looking for and doing that logic for you. I mentioned that the backpack also has data. And if we go back to the zip version of that, we can take a look. It's stored in this data folder, and we had that one data lookup file. So if we go back to our demo files, I already pulled that out. And when you look into it, it's a BCP file. So if I open that in Notepad++, we can actually look and say, hey, look, oh dear, it's our data, unencrypted. So we may want to be really careful how we deal with this sort of things, because this was, when I discovered this, I was like, ooh, I remember using BCP and this is native format, but yeah, that's my data unencrypted in this file. So it's very useful, but definitely don't check it in anywhere, because, well, especially the more sensitive data that you can have. Just one of those things to be aware of. All right, so back to our database project. Wrong one. Close that out. Database project. So now we have our DAC pack that we've created from our project. So now we need to think about how we deploy. So here it's really more, deploy solution. So I can right click and hit deploy. So it's going to build, and it doesn't like something that I did because my build failed. Error project, it specifies cannot be published to 2016. So I must have a reference wrong. So let me look at my properties. Not that one. Project settings, 2019. This build, maybe it's in the solution side that's a problem, because this build worked nicely. So I'm not sure what that is. I will look at that later. But anyway, I can still go to publish from my project. So this is the screen I was hoping for. So now I can sit there and say which database I want, what the name is, the publish script. I can save the profile so I can reuse it. We'll be able to generate scripts and we'll be able to publish. So we'll look at those shortly. So first I'm going to choose deploy me state. This is what we're going to use for our test. And then we can do things like generate script, or we can just publish. So one of the things is sorry, my Zoom, it's being weird. Let me go back to Management Studio for a moment. And I think Visual Studio is hiding it. So we go back to Management Studio, my deploy me state. If we look at our tables, we can see we have nothing here. So brand new database. Let me go back to Visual Studio. Let's close this window. And now let's do our publish again. Edit, deploy me state, and I'm just going to hit publish. So now what we can see is it's coming up with a publish preview. And this is where, depending on the number of objects you have, it can take a while. I know some people do not like state-based because what it's doing is it's taking my DAC pack, it's comparing it against what's in my database, and then it's executing everything. And the cool thing is we've got a little bit of things of doing. We saw what it was doing. There's some output. And if I go to the database operation tools, I can click view script. Because now that it's run, I want to know what was run. Kind of funny that way. So let me close this. And again, my Visual Studio does not like to refresh. I'm not sure what that is, but it's okay because the script is still here. So as you can see that it does things, we know it gives you the messages generated by a tool. We know it needs to be in SQL command mode because we can see these set variables. It does things like on an error exit. And then it can detract, make sure is this everything set on that's supposed to be. And we can see variables. We use our database name. It separates that. And then it does everything to create our objects. So kind of what you would expect. It's all brand new, so it knows there's nothing new for tables. So if I go down to the bottom, we can start seeing my procedures. It's all create procedures. It knows it doesn't exist. So this is the way it's going to work. It knows it just needs to be created. Now, one particular thing about using database projects is it's very particular on how you have the scripts. So if I were to click on one of the scripts here, let's go flip back, notice it is create procedure. Database projects are very particular. You can't say create or alter procedure. You have to just say create procedure. You can't say if not exist, create table. It just is create table. It doesn't allow, if it's going to be part of the build, it doesn't allow you to do any of the checks that you may do or may need for migration scripts. So this is where things get a little hairy when you want to do things and you need to care about how you're doing those. Data is the big example for that one. So, but before we do that, I want to just do a quick example. Now that everything has been deployed to my database, what happens if I build again? Because I've built it, I want it to run. So let's go and let's hit publish. Deploy me state. And I'm just going to hit generate script. So it's publishing. So what it's doing is it's got to do the compare. What do I have here? And then what do I have in my database? I now have 1,000 objects in my database because I just created those. So it's now doing that compare. And so it created the script. So let's look at that script now. That was original. And now we can see this new script. And you'll notice it's empty. Why? Because everything is there. So now let's add data. So I have already created my folder. So I'm going to go add an existing item because I've already created one in that demo data folder. So let's go back up here, demo, lookup 10 data. And so I'm going to add this. And I'm going to go ahead and open this so we can see what I pulled in. Now notice I'm doing multiple steps. This is where database projects get weird because if I were to try to build this, the good news is this worked. So the reason that's, I'm wondering if I didn't fully set up things before it, and I did. I thought I'd set this up beforehand, but it's good. It's a good example because I've set my build action to none. This means that my build is ignoring this file. But if I set this to build and try it again, it worked. It normally doesn't. This one normally fails. Why? Because it's doing multiple setups for this. But then the thing is, I don't want this added. I want this run a certain way. So I need to have this work as a separate script. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to none, but I'm going to add what's called a post-deploy script. So what that means is I'm not going to build this. If I were to run this, it's not going to run. So I'm going to hit none. Let's just do a quick build. And let's do a quick publish to create the script. Generate script. And we can see it's not there. We haven't run it yet. We're saying none, so we don't want it to run. So that's the way that's working. One thing to also note is the way the script works, where I've got a bunch of things I'm inserting into a temp table. And then at the bottom, this is where I'm doing my insert. And this is also the important thing to note too, when you're thinking about how you're building scripts, how do you want the data to work? Especially because data is really important. Sometimes you're going to add default data and it should only be what you need it to be. Sometimes it just needs to be there and the client can make whatever changes there are, whether it exists or not. They can maybe they can only update. Maybe they can add and you just need to add as well. Whatever it is, but you need to make sure that your data does it the way you want it to. And that's kind of what I've done here. I'm just dumping everything into a temp table and then working it that way. But now I need this to run. I've set the file as none because it should fail when I set it to include in the build. I'm not sure why it didn't, but it normally would. But it means I need to create what's called a post-deployment script to make this work. So I'm going to hit add, and where to go? Here's add, and I'm going to add a new item, and it's loading a bunch of templates. I'm going to go to scripts, and then I'm going to choose a post-deployment script. And what it does is just sets up a basic template. Now I've already keep moving this when I don't mean to. So I'm going to go back to my window, and again, for some reason, Visual Studio is just not playing well tonight. I've already created this post-deployment script as to what I want it to look like. So I'm just going to click it up here, and let's go back to Visual Studio. And because it's SQL command, it's written this way. What it's going to do is going to pull in that script and create it here when it creates the build. So let's look at that example. Let's do our build. And let's publish. And let's just generate our script so we can see the example. Doing the compare, because it's got to figure out what's going to be put together. And then I can view my script. And actually it's pulling up right here. And we can see that the build brought in my script. There's no other changes, but we can see now that this is a script that was generated for me to create dummy data. And we can see everything that we saw before. Pretty simple. So now, what other sort of changes could we do? Let's think about the change that we did where I moved that store procedure to a different schema. So how am I going to do that? Well, because I like to keep things organized, I'm going to create a new folder. So let's add new folder. I'm going to call it demo setup. And now I'm going to, in here, I'm going to add a new folder called stored procedures. And now I can go add an existing item, go my demo files. Let's do I believe this is my demi table and proc creation. And if I open this up, it is create or alter. We know I can't do that. But we know it also needs to be so demi setup is we need to give it the schema or demo setup. So now that's created here. And the next thing I need to do is I also need to make sure that my schema gets added. And so let me add another existing item. Demo setup schema, add. But again, because I'm dealing with a database project, I can't do these checks. So I can save that. And then now I can go do my build. So everything builds, it all works. But here's the thing though. This was an existing store procedure. So I probably have it right here. So I don't want this here because I moved it somewhere else. So what's going to happen if let's say I delete this file because I just created it somewhere else. So now as essentially, according to my scripts, I've now moved that store procedure here. So what does that look like? Let's deploy and find out. So let's do a build. I think when you publish, it'll automatically do the build. I always prefer doing it separately just because I want to make sure it's good before I hit publish. So I really should have saved this as a profile, but that's okay. But I'm going to go ahead and hit generate script because for the purposes of what we're doing, I kind of want to bring out this point about state-based. It's doing my compare. All right, so now it's done. It's created my script. So a couple things to notice here. I'm creating the new schema. I'm creating the procedure as a new schema. What we're not seeing is if this runs as is, the store procedure that's existing is here. Now I could set up an option as part of my publish profile to say if the object doesn't exist, drop it. But what does it mean that I'm creating this store, that it's a create procedure? What I did with my migration is I said, no, this one still exists. I just want you to move it, move the schema that it's in. This actually matters, especially if you're doing things like, I don't know, query store, where you're keeping track of a procedure. If you drop and create a procedure, it's no longer considered the same proc. SQL Server doesn't know that it's the same. It doesn't know that this ID you just dropped is really this ID here. So you start creating connections. So when you're keeping track of things, did this regress? Did this improve? Whatever you're looking for that deployment process, whatever you're using to track it, you've just broken the connection. So you want to be really careful on how you deal with database projects. Well, not just that, but with any state-based, all it knows is I have a procedure here and a procedure here, and the schemas are different. So it doesn't understand that you just moved the procedure to a new schema, that it's actually the same one. That's really important to keep track of and to really understand when you're dealing with state-based migration, because this can't handle those sort of alters. Depending on how you do table changes, if the columns got out of order, that may create a problem with how the compare works and how that works. And what is the type of statement that gets created. So you want to be really careful with some of these different changes as to how it's going to be picked up. But the other thing to note is my post deployment script. I've already run this. This is going to run again. This means whatever you have in your post deployment script is essentially a migration script. It needs to be idempotent because it's going to run every time you deploy, whether you need it to or not. So you really got to make sure that you're paying attention to it so it's doing exactly what you want it to. So These are very, very basic examples, but they kind of want to show you things you want to pay attention to as you're putting those together. Again, I'm not claiming to be an expert, but it's really important to just kind of see the basic things of what we do every day with our scripts and how we have to manage them depending on how we deploy them. Because again, it's not the deployment process that I'm spending all this time on. It's okay, which folder is it? What's the name is it? What script is being generated? How does this look? And really thinking about all of those things in terms of, is it state-based or is it migration? Are there any questions? Hopefully I haven't lost y'all.
No, I think we're still here. I'm good.
Okay. All right. So as I said, this really wasn't in to get into how we connect these for our CI and CD, but it's really understanding how these different types of changes work and different things you need to think about when you work with them. So that's really what I wanted to show you with that. And so let's move Visual Studio out of the way because it's not playing nice with everything else here tonight. But again, hopefully you have an idea of better understanding of the mechanics of how they work. It's really not anything big, but it's really understanding how they work so we have the implications of what it is. It's the details of working within it. So that means that there are all these considerations. Source control. Y'all notice that I didn't fully go into how we're checking things in, but it does get into our folder structure, our naming conventions. I've used Flyway before, and Flyway is super strict about your naming conventions, and it uses it as the way to determine what scripts to run, not just what's in that log file. So, but again, naming conventions in general. Like I said, hey, I like having a file where I know this, I can look at it and say, this object has this schema and this name. I like knowing that just by looking at the script. But that's also just me. Whatever naming convention is, you want to make sure it's easy for everyone on your team to know. Because again, that's going to get checked to source control. Everyone has access to it. The folder structure, where am I going to looking for things? Big one is your instances and environments. Are you dealing with individual developer instances? Are you dealing with shared environments? Because that also plays things too. I'm setting up a sandbox. I'm using state-based migration. My sandbox is a mess, but I'm going to use state-based migration. So I have to understand how it's going to look, what my script is going to look like when it does the compare. I didn't mention it, but that's also where source control plays in if you're doing branches. Because, I just checked in this change and it's sitting in this branch. I have another set of change which is in this branch over here. Those changes aren't in the same branch yet because the pull request hasn't gone through yet. But I need to make sure that I'm testing this. What script is my script going to look like? If I'm using state-based, what does that matter? If I'm testing using migration, especially one that keeps a log of files. How does that work? How do you manage those? All of these start playing in together because, we have different instances and different environments. And this is where if your source control is the source of truth, how do I know that my scripts are working properly? What am I comparing? How is that all going out? Because this is where we start getting into the release process. Are we using CI/CD? Are we using installers? When we talk about those instances of shared environments, um, are we doing CI/CD releases? Is it, am I running an installer on those environments? Um, are you doing feature releases? Are you doing versioned releases? How are you keeping track of those? I think I have a reference later on where someone talks about how you can version your DAC packs, and you can use those as a way to figure out what you need to release and some cool things you can do with that. This last one I think is highly underrated. We know it matters though, which is that chain of command. In other words, who's responsible for the process? Are you responsible for deploying it? Are you responsible for setting it up? Are you responsible for testing it? If not, someone else up the chain needs to know whatever pains you have based on whatever your deployment methods are, and hopefully they understand that it's subtle details that matter, right? Hopefully they understand those so they can help you with whatever issues you have. Um, because again, it's how release engineering works. Um, again, various things. There are lots of things at play, lots of moving parts, and making sure all of those moving parts are talking to each other to make sure that however you're deploying, whatever method you're using to deploy your databases, they're involved and they're aware of what these different things mean. More things to consider: your deployment window. I worked at a place where it was, again, most of the things I've done have been migration based, but it used, I think it did use SQL command to run my scripts. SQL command .NET. .NET automatic default connection is 30 seconds. If you're trying to deploy an index and you have 30 seconds and it's going to a table which has millions of records, if you're lucky, it could take 5 minutes. But if your connection for what's running your script only is 30 seconds, you have to consider that. It's not just, we have an outage between 2 hours. I mean, you need to consider that too, but also thinking about how does this deployment window affect how you're doing your deploys. Um, if you can't deploy an index with everything else, well, how do you do a state-based? Pre-deployment script may not work for you, or you want to do it another time, or you have to split up your deployments, especially when it's production and you only have those limited times. You end up getting kind of creative with how you have to do deployments. So that's actually a big thing that you need to consider on how you're deploying changes. Again, something simple as an index can trip you up. My dilemma with the 30 seconds is I said, how many rows are in this table? Over 10,000? Yeah, I'm not going to trust it. 10,000 still feels kind of low, but I'm not going to trust it if I only have 30 seconds. So I'm just going to create a job to run overnight that's going to add all of the indexes and just have it run once, and I should be all set. And if it fails, I can run the job again, but it doesn't stop everything else from going out. But again, these are the things we have to think about: is how we deploy, how do we set it up? Because that was all done through the script that I had the installer run. So it's a weird game you have to play, but you have to take that into consideration as well. I think we talked a little bit about data changes, because again, it's one of those things where, um, is that script running all the time? Is it running once? What do you need? How do you need that data to be handled when there's already data existing? Um, and it's one of those tricky things you have to figure out. But again, it's one of those things. Again, if you're doing state-based, if you have a DAC pack and you're not including the data, you got to make sure you have that post-deployment script. Um, so it's really interesting on how you're figuring those different things out. If you're using another third-party state-based migration, how do they handle data changes? It's one of those questions. I don't have an answer on it, but you get definitely something you'll want to consider. Installs versus upgrades. We kind of covered that. I mean, my thought is I like the same scripts to be used for both. They don't have to be, but how am I doing them differently? Maybe I want a DAC pack for a new install and do um, migration scripts for an upgrade because I can control that better. I don't know. But again, it goes back to what are our requirements, all of these other things we have to consider. Maybe it's too difficult to do both. I don't know. It's up to you. You got to figure out your environment and know your databases. Someone earlier talked about testing. I didn't quite bring up T-SQL-T testing. In some ways, it's unit testing. So the way you're going to want to set that up varies. Do you need testing involved as part of your release process? That's something that you need to consider, maybe. How do you test your release and confirm that they work well? Is it T-SQL-T or is it something else? But I'm a big fan of, you got to test your releases. How else do you know that what you're releasing is what you want it to and it's going to look right? Or it's going to handle any sort of the most common issues that you're going to run into. Um, you can't account for everything, but if you can account for a lot of the different issues, hopefully that means that when you deploy, it goes much smoother. This is a fun one: client customization or schema drift. Clients will do things to your database if they own the server and it's on their premise, and their control once you release it to them. If they can do anything, hopefully they're following your guidelines. Our companies in the past, when we've worked with installers, we'd said, you can add your own tables, but if you modify ours, we have a right to undo what you did because that's our intellectual property, because that's our schema. Hopefully everyone followed it, but what happens when that occurs? Schema drift. How many changes are going on? How are you dealing with those? What happens if you're doing a state-based and the database that you're working on is just very different? I'm setting up a sandbox. The database I was given was a very, very old, out-of-date version. How am I dealing with a state-based migration, state-based deployment of my new code to this thing that is just very far off? Got to consider, is that something that I'm going to want to deal with if that's what it looks like in production? Again, I have to consider that because as someone pointed out earlier, what happens when we do what happens when there's errors during deploys? How do we handle those and how are we prepared to? Bigger, what if it's a horrible upgrade process and you got to roll back, everything has to go back? It's really hard to deal with, but you have to figure out, how does that plan into however you're deploying things? So in some ways, feel like I'm leaving you with a lot more questions than answers. And I only partially apologize for that. Partly because understanding how migrations work, whether it's a state-based migration or script or sorry, migration deployment versus state-based deployment, understanding those basic concepts and seeing those in action, those are kind of easy to understand. You have to understand those because, again, that's the foundation of what you're doing, and everything else is based on it. Deployment strategy is hard. We have multiple conversations about this in my company right now. This strategy is hard. You have some people who love migration. You have some people who love state-based. But it's really understanding the details. This is where that whole requirements. What are you trying to deal with? All those different issues that I just said, these are things you need to consider. Those are not easy things to figure out. They aren't. Um, but I think we kind of blame them on the tools. Oh, we're using CI/CD. Oh, we're using DevOps. That solves our problem. No, you have to understand, are you doing state-based? Are you doing migration? All those little details, because you can't just roll back a database. It doesn't quite work that way. So with that, I'm going to leave you a bunch of resources. Some of the things that I've mentioned: Flyway, Liquibase, SQL Package, which again is Microsoft database projects. Again, that's built in with Microsoft. Some general blog posts. A lot of these kind of help me form ideas and understand things better as I put them together. This first one is DB Maestro. They're actually a third-party deployment tool. I think they build themselves as kind of a both state-based and migration, but I really liked how they defined state-based and migration-driven. I thought that was really good. A couple other blog posts from people in the community: Kendra Little, Greg Lowe. As I was putting this together the first time, some of these blog posts just appeared. I'm like, oh, perfect timing. So also thinking about how these work into continuous integration. Again, I didn't want to cover that because my purpose was really more to understand what the difference between those two deployment methods are and how they work. But all of these will help you build upon those ideas as well, including things like, hey, where do you want to keep these in the repository? Again, it builds into how everything works together. So, any questions at this point? I don't see anything in the chat. I feel like I'm rambling a lot. Is there any way to integrate T-SQL-T with the database projects? I think there is.
Sorry, that might have been a little off topic, but when you showed me something like, oh, there's a tool that you can use for unit testing for SQL Server. Oh my gosh, I didn't even know about it.
So what T-SQL-T, if you think about it, sure, it should be. But this is where you start thinking about, and I'm going to pose this question to you. When you say integrate T-SQL-T with the database project, and for those who don't know, SSDT, SQL Server data tools. And so when you set database projects up in Visual Studio, that's what you're looking for. It is a separate extension for Azure Data Studio and Visual Studio Code. It's just DB projects. but Visual Studio refers to it as data tools. So when you're talking about integrating T-SQL-T, what do you mean by integration?
Well, let's think about a typical Visual Studio C# project. I would have my unit tests as a separate project within that solution, so I can run my unit tests against my solution, and the whole thing can be deployed through DevOps at the same time, right? And my unit tests will run there as well. But I mean, from a developer standpoint, I would love to be able to run my unit tests against my solution as a separate, in Visual Studio, it's typically a separate project.
All right. So here's my off the cuff idea with that. Sure, you could create a new project in here, and you can have that project reference. You can have multiple projects reference each other. So I'm a little scared to try this now, but yeah, you should be able to create a new. I do have at work. I do have a database, a solution with multiple projects in it, and they are database projects. So you would probably add a new project and have the project be reference this project, and you can put your, all T-SQL-T is under the covers is store procedures. So you've got a T-SQL-T schema. So you make sure your script is there. And then you're adding you would add a project and just have your store procedures there, and just be careful of where you're deploying that, that project. Because again, it's just SQL scripts. If you want to have them automatically run, I think that gets into a little more of how you're setting up your publish profile. I know that if you're doing, let's say you had the deploy publish in like DevOps, you could probably set up I'm trying to think of the wordings, where you have like the one step is do your publish of the project. So you deploy your project, and then the second one would be to deploy the T-SQL-T project. So you should be, so I think you can, that's how off the cuff I would do something like that, but I don't see why you couldn't include in your solution a second project which just has your T-SQL-T code.
Okay. Well, I'll do some investigation. Thank you.
Yeah. Again, I would do it. Yeah. I mean, because again, I would have that project reference this first one, because when you do the compare, this is what I've been finding out with that project that I've had with the two. And this is one of those things you also have to be careful about when you do compares and do those things, is making sure you have the right settings. Because you can deploy this, but if you're deploying it against a database which has the T-SQL-T code, you need to make sure, don't drop it. But then the DAC pack for T-SQL-T would be kept separate, but you have the reference to this one. So definitely play around with what the publish profiles. Definitely look into SQL package exe and that link, because that's going to tell you a lot more options of what you do. When the publish that I use here is calling SQL package exe underneath the covers. And I believe there are a lot more options that you have with that than you do here. So I do believe that you can do that, because I know you can have multiple database projects in the same solution. But like I said, I've been finding that doing that at work, I find weird things with it. So I don't know if I'm ever going to feel comfortable using a deploy while those two projects are related to each other. I created different projects so I could separate them later, but we'll see what happens with that. Stay tuned. But that's a great question, a way to think about that. Hey, Jeff. I will tell Andy you say hi, but I'm glad you stopped by, even if you're just catching me now.
Yeah, I'm catching the end here. Sure, I'm sorry I missed this one. I got busy and I missed an invite apparently. So anyways, thank you for presenting with it for us. I really appreciate it.
Oh,
Well,
I'm glad.
Well, good news,
Hopefully,
Jeff. I remembered to hit the record button this time. So,
woohoo!
which I'll go ahead and stop the recording at this point.
Okay.
And I was going to ask, I'm going to try and get this published out someplace so we can